Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in world history. We're going to start the Holocaust today. And this is one of those topics that is eternally fascinating for all the wrong reasons. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what the Holocaust is, in a nutshell, it's the Nazis, led by Hitler, systematically killing 11 million people in Europe during the 1930s and 1940s. 6 million of those victims were Jews. So we are going to kind of look at this piece by piece, starting with the background to the murder here today. So we've got one constructive response question we're going to seek to answer with this, and it's a really good background question. The question says, summarize. Other than the Holocaust, what other hardships have Jewish people experienced in their existence? There's no doubt that this is not an isolated incident in history. The Jews have been, for lack of a better word, picked on and persecuted in many different eras in history, and we're going to look at that as part of our background here today. So ultimately, what will we learn from the background to the murder here today? We are going to start with the historical look at the Hebrew people. The Hebrew people later become the Jews, and this is where we're going to work in what we need to answer the constructive response question that we just looked at. So we will look at some other places in history that Jews have been mistreated. We're going to talk a little bit about Jewish culture, and this is going to help set us up later on in the unit, especially when we watch the film Schindler's List. So we have a pretty good understanding of what it means to be a Jew, really, because there are some cultural practices that are worth mentioning. And then we are going to look at the other side. So we'll start with Jewish culture, but then we'll look at the Nazi side as well. So we'll talk about the Nazis and their actions. So that's where we're going with this today. So, background to the murder, setting the stage. First of all, let's get sort of a good definition here. The Holocaust really comes through ultimately, there's 11 million people that are killed in the Holocaust, 6 million of which are Jews. But Holocaust itself is a thorough destruction involving extensive loss of life, often through fire. What's interesting about this definition is the Holocaust will not see people necessarily killed by fire as more as they are eradicated and their bodies are destroyed by fire. So we're going to talk about how crematoriums were used throughout the Holocaust. But really what we're dealing with here is genocide. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group. In the last unit in our imperialism unit, we talked about the genocide in Rwanda and the genocide in Darfur. So it's when one group is trying to remove another group, and that's definitely what's going to be happening here in the Holocaust. So in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, attempted to wipe out the Jewish population of Europe. In the end, they killed over 6 million Jews. Like I said, it's 11 million total, but 6 million of that were Jewish people, and they were the prime target of the Nazis. Now, Jewish people today call the Holocaust the Shoah. So the Shoah is the Jewish name for the Jewish Holocaust of the 1930s and 1940s. So you might hear that or see that if you decide to study the Holocaust a little bit more in detail. So let's take a look at a rocky past of the Hebrew people. This dates back to our unit on ancient Egypt when we introduced the Hebrew people. So we're certainly making connections across history here. So the ancient Hebrew people were led by Abraham. Abraham became the father of the Hebrew people. If you recall, Abraham made a covenant or a promise with God that he would follow God's laws and obey God as long as God protected him. And so when we look at the origin of the Hebrew story, it starts really with Abraham. Continuing on, we know that Abraham and the Hebrews eventually migrated out of Canaan, which was in modern-day Palestine, which is where modern-day Israel is, at the southeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea, and decided to migrate down to Egypt. They did so because there was better land down there due to the Nile River. But they were enslaved for hundreds of years in Egypt until Moses led the Hebrews out of Egypt through the Exodus, and that's what you see down here. So we've talked about this. This story should sound familiar to you. The Hebrews later became known as Jews, and follow Judaism as their religion. So again, we talked about the kingdom of Judah, which eventually gave rise to the term Judaism. Now, Judaism is a monotheistic religion, which means they believe in one God. And it became a source of conflict for those who were polytheistic, such as the ancient Egyptians and eventually the ancient Romans. Those two groups of people believed in many different gods and did not take kindly to people who believed in only one God. So you've got a difference in culture there. And we've seen throughout history when one ethnic group or cultural group believes in something different than another group, they don't always get along. So that's definitely the case here. Now, we have to understand when Jesus was born a Jew. And later, because of his followers, they became known as Christians. So Christians broke away from Judaism in part because they believed Jesus was the Messiah. Jews do not believe this. They say Jesus is a very important person, but they don't see him as the Messiah or the, God who has come to save us and everything like that. So, and there's other differences. There were some Christians or Jews, I should say, that decided not to stay and protect the Jewish temple that was going to be destroyed by the Romans. And so the Jews that said, hey, if you don't stay and fight, you're not one of us anymore. And so those other Jews left and they became known as Christians after that, or followers of Christ. So there's a lot more to it than that story, but that is kind of it in a nutshell. Continuing on with this rocky past, the Jews not only were targeted in Egypt, they were also persecuted by the Romans. So Jews have been targets of persecution by the Romans. They were slaughtered by crusaders during the 11th and 12th centuries, and many others in history. And part of the reason they were killed by crusaders, if you remember when we talked about the Crusades, it was Christians going and trying to reclaim the Holy Land of Jerusalem for Christianity. Well, anybody along the way that was seen as a non-believer was expendable, and that meant Muslims and Jews. So many Jews were killed during this process. So anti-Semitism is really kind of been around for a long time. Anti-Semitism is hatred or prejudice against Jews. So we've seen it in Rome, we've seen it in Egypt, we've seen it in the Crusades. This image here shows how they would sometimes light Jews and even Christians on fire during the time of the Roman Empire. So certainly a lot of really kind of dark history here when we look at the Hebrew people. When I say the Hebrew people, I really mean the Jews. Like I said, they eventually became known as Jews because of Judaism. Let's talk a little bit about Jewish culture. And part of the reason we need to talk about this, we have to understand this ethnic group. And that'll certainly help us when we watch the film Schindler's List, which is ultimately what we're building up to here. So just about every major religion has a sacred text. In this case, for the Jewish people, it's the Torah. And most Torahs are seen on scrolls like you see here. So if you were to ever go to a Jewish temple, you would see them read from the Torah via scroll rather than through pages of a book. So most of what we know of early Hebrew history is found in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Torah. Most Torahs are read on scrolls and are written in Hebrew. So knowing that language becomes very important if you consider yourself a Jewish person. Now, the people that are meant to teach this are rabbis. So you can see rabbis here. This is typical dress of a Jewish rabbi. Rabbis are teachers of the Torah. In a way, they're like priests or pastors in Christianity. They're the ones who are there to help people interpret and understand what's going on in their holy text. Some cultural traditions of Jewish people: eating of pork is forbidden. So you don't ever see Jewish people having a nice pork chop or anything to do with pigs, which could be like sausage or bratwurst for that matter. Now, Jews often only marry other Jews. And the reason I put this in here is some ethnic groups are a little bit more strict on this, marrying within your religion. And you might see this in Christianity too. Some Lutherans prefer to only marry Lutherans. Some Catholics prefer to marry only other Catholics. In my family, my father was a Catholic and my mother was a Lutheran, and they got married. But in the Jewish tradition, it is more desirable to marry another Jew. And that's just for obvious reasons, for tradition and for continuity and things like that. But of course, it's just something they very strongly believe in. Now, one of their most holy days is Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, is one of the holiest days for Jews. So you'll see them honor this day and recognize it, and certainly it's a very important religious holiday for Jewish people. Jews do not believe in hell, so a little bit different than the customs of Christians. And many Jewish men cover their heads with the yarmulke, or kippas, which you see here. So you'll see sometimes they're white, you've got the Star of David on there. Sometimes they're black, but oftentimes you'll see that. And you'll definitely see that in the film Schindler's List. So what we've done here is we've established kind of who the Jews are, where they came from, how they've been mistreated in the past. What we want to do with part 2 is we want to move forward and add kind of the evil ingredient to it, which is Nazism and Adolf Hitler. So we're going to kind of start taking this Jewish tradition. We're going to see how one group really targets them, and this is going to move us closer to the actual events of the Holocaust. So you can go ahead and end part 1 and queue up part 2.